What's next for markets?
I'm Michael Kantrowitz, Chief Investment Strategist at Piper Sandler, where I lead the portfolio strategy team, recently ranked #1 on Wall Street in the 2024 All-America Institutional Investor Research Survey. In this week's episode, we have a special guest joining us for an important discussion. As always, I'll be here with my partner, Stephen Gregory, who leads the quantitative research effort at Piper Sandler. We're thrilled to welcome Don Schneider, Deputy Head of U.S. Policy Research at Piper Sandler. Welcome back, Don. Glad to have you on. We're recording this on Friday, October 10th, and a bunch of news has hit the tape as recent as 37 minutes ago, and certainly in the last few days regarding the shutdown. You've done some great work on that recently, as well as I want to touch on tax refunds and what that's going to look like coming into 2026. But maybe let's, before we jump into the most recent news on Trump's threat to raising China tariffs, how have your thinking evolved now that we're a few weeks into the shutdown? How has it changed? What are you hearing, and what are you guys thinking as of now?
Thanks again for having me on. So on the shutdown, our view coming into this, we adopted a view, our shutdown is the base case mid-September, and we kind of came to that view that this was politics. This really wasn't about healthcare. Democrats made the decision that they needed to shut down the government to take a stand against Trump. Really, it was Schumer's decision. Progressive base was furious that in March he was put in a similar position and didn't have any negotiating demands, just agreed to keep the government open, because historically it's a losing fight. If you make a partisan demand in exchange for a routine funding bill, the public moves against you because they lose their government services, people lose paychecks for the sake of something that is inherently partisan and you don't have the votes for. So Schumer knew that, but had to go forward with it this time. And it kind of feels like luck, or the sentiment is shifting a bit in Democrats' favor, leading to them to stick this out longer. So I think the takeaway for investors is, we initially thought this would last 2 weeks, say come on October 15th when the active duty military doesn't get paid. That would probably be an action forcing date. But Democrats are getting quite comfortable. Part of this is because, Trump has just seeking to manage the shutdown in a way that alleviates some of the pain. Like, he hasn't furloughed as many people as he could. He hasn't done these mass layoffs that he's talked about. This program for women, infants, and children called WIC, they're going to find a way to fund that. He said he will find a way to pay the military, like using what's called mandatory funding, something that normally doesn't get done. So he's potentially doing a lot of things that make this less painful for Democrats. Or when he's trying to be vindictive in a way, canceling infrastructure contracts for New York, that's only kind of reinforcing, they're helping Democrats with their grievance sentiment, or that they need to just stick it out longer. So I think both of those strategies have backfired and allowed Democrats to settle in for longer. I think part of this is some Democrats they see it as kind of a win-win. If they stick it out a long time, maybe Republicans will cave and give them the healthcare policy they want, which is an extension of the Obamacare subsidies. It's about $30 billion a year in reduced premiums or additional coverage for about 4 million people. Or if they don't get anything, Republicans will have to take the blame for healthcare entirely. Or Republicans are forced to end the filibuster for funding bills. It kind of just chips away at the filibuster, which is something they themselves want to eliminate. So anyway, I think the takeaways for investors are this is going to last longer than we thought. We were thinking maybe 2 weeks, like up until the October 15th deadline. This could now stretch on weeks. Some Democrats are saying, we're not going to stop. We're going to get through November 1, which is when the enrollment period begins. And that means people will lose coverage at that date. Or if you haven't extended the policy by that date, you'll start to see coverage losses. So this could last longer. That means more delayed reports. We're flying blind on data for longer. It will start to not only delay the existing releases, but it will affect the collection of data for subsequent reports that we would otherwise get in November. So one little wrinkle there, Trump is calling back workers at the BLS to finish the CPI that's going to come out soon. And part of the reason for that is the September CPI, that's the end of the fiscal year. So it serves as the basis for COLAs and coming for programs. So it's kind of important to do that. So anyway, missed paychecks, more government services that were canceled, the pain, like how does this end? I think there's two ways. Either the pain has got to build. Regular voters, which are kind of tuning all this out, need to feel more of that pain in order to force Democrats off of their position. Or Trump needs to kind of offer some sort of healthcare concession or something to change the momentum. But right now, we're in a stasis and things aren't progressing.
Michael and I felt a little bit of the civilian pain last night when we were trying to fly into Newark Airport and delays.
Oh, really? Were there TSA delays? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's a problem. I mean, you had, when the 2018 shutdown, there was, I think over 30 days, and you just started having air traffic controller attrition or TSA workers not coming in. So, it may take something like that, just a long period of time for this to kind of get Democrats to shift off of their position.
They were explicit about it last night too. They said this was a air traffic control situation and they're just slowing down planes into Newark. But it's interesting you're saying that it's a kind of a soft shutdown from the Republican side, and that's kind of even giving more fuel to the Democratic stance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Trump could, he could furlough a lot more people. He's not. I mean, he's doing a pretty good job of keeping most government services open. He's tried to say, when you are in a shutdown, you're afforded legal authority to kind of determine what's essential and what's not. And he's used that to kind of target New York. That's where Jeffries and Schumer are from. He's trying to concentrate it on New York, but it's backfiring. It means less people feel the pain. And then if you're, being selective in how you apply a shutdown, you're not just saying, hey, I'm going to follow the letter of the law. We're going to shut down the programs we have to shut down, and so be it. If you're now targeting New York, it only reinforces Democrats' point, which is, we can't cut funding deals with this guy when he's, using that authority in a vindictive way.
Expectations on how much longer this could last?
It seems we've already missed the deadline to pay the military. Their paycheck will come on October 15th. So now it's kind of really in Trump's court. So the Democrats have basically made peace with that. So I don't think this is going to be a next week thing. I think this could 3 weeks kind of get maybe towards the end of the month. And, Trump, it's either the pain builds and then Democrats shift their position, or Trump does something that changes the dynamic. But with Hamas and, Israel, he's got now China. There's just so many other distractions that it's kind of hard to get him engaged on this issue.
So speaking of what will Trump do, the news today that Michael mentioned on China tariffs and the administration being upset about rare earths. Any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, our view on China was that, we were in kind of a sticky or stable situation with the tariffs at 30%. So, recapping, he had 25% on China in his first term, comes out of the gate with these fentanyl and illegal immigration related tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico. China flexed its muscles on rare earths and magnets, and we de-escalate and we settle at 30%. And I think Trump he pushed China as far as they could, and they could live with those 30% tariffs in place. So they're a meaningful source of revenue. The administration saw it as accomplishing some of their key industrial policy goals, but they really couldn't take it much further. And it seemed like China was stable, and that was fine. And that they were going to talk in South Korea at the end of the month. And who knows? There was this Wall Street Journal report that Xi Jinping was going to make, demands or, not demands, but try and push Trump towards softening his position on Taiwan or something like that. And this does come as a surprise in a way that China now is being the aggressor here. And, why would they do that? Why would they provoke Trump with, threatening the export of rare earths and all these export controls? Trump doesn't respond well to being attacked like that. His responses go back over the top. That's how he got to 145% rate. So, yeah, I think the provocation is a bit of a surprise, and it's hard to see. Maybe they're just trying to flex and soften him up and make the U.S. realize that China does indeed have more leverage. I think our view on this is he's saying, we don't need to meet now. So there's still a chance for it to de-escalate. But I think what investors should take away from this is just highlighting, trade instability, that, high tariff rates are here to stay. Even if Trump, say, loses this IEEPA case, he's going to go back to that 30% on China and potentially much more now. And yeah, circumstances can change. Trading partners can retaliate, legal circumstances change, or Trump is never done with policy. So I think that the instability will be with us.
So you just mentioned the IEEPA case. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, our view, and my colleague Andy has been writing on this for a while, and just to kind of recap the kind of legal reasons and then what we think will be. But in short, Congress has the power to tax. They can delegate that authority to the executive branch. In all these instances where they've done so, they've given the president the ability to levy tariffs under really specific conditions. Like in Section 122, the tariffs can only last 150 days. They have to have a specific reason, and they can only be a maximum rate of 15%. Or say in the case of Section 301, which Trump has used to tariff China, you have to prove by an investigation that there was some sort of trade harm. And then you can use tariffs as a corrective remedy. So Trump, in his first term, had to substantiate that China was stealing intellectual property. So if that was, how we write trade law, where Congress delegates power to the executive branch to tax in limited circumstances, how is it then in IEEPA, this emergency statute that doesn't even reference tariffs, it references like basically regulating importation, that he has unbounded authority to tariff products, really for any reason, for any duration, at any rate. So on that basis, we've been of the mind that the Supreme Court would strike down his authority to use IEEPA. We felt relatively confident about that. The Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in early November. They, may make a decision within 4 to 12 weeks. So maybe early December to sometime in February, the court, we believe, will strike down his IEEPA authority. The net result of that, there's a few things that I think investors are looking at. Well, what does this mean for refunds? Is kind of like it would be, if a decision were made by, say, the end of December, that could be up to $140 billion in refunds the administration would be forced to dole out if the Supreme Court forces that. I think we've looked at other cases in the past where there have been these sort of damages that the court hasn't, forced repayment of. So I don't think that's a sure thing at all. I think if you look at betting markets, last I checked, they were like, okay, 55% chance Trump loses this case, but only 15% chance, or like 25% conditional odds that there would be refunds. So I don't have a strong view on whether there would be refunds out of it. I think the most important thing is, okay, if the administration loses, then what? And does Trump take that as an opportunity to de-escalate? Is that really bullish or no? And our view is he can reconstitute a lot of the tariffs using authority he already has. And I think the most important thing to look at is, what is Trump's intent? Like, does he see trade policy as, important for industrial policy, onshoring jobs, helping worker wages, rebuilding manufacturing and generating revenue? Yes. So if we believe those things, then he's not just going to say, oh, well, IEEPA is gone, I can't do anything now. What we think he will do is, right off the gate, he has this Section 122 power that allows him to do 15% tariffs for 150 days. In most of these cases where he's, given the deal to other countries, it's 10 to 15% in most cases. So that backfills the loss of IEEPA. But in cases like China, which is 30%, or Brazil, some goods are 50%, or other countries that have higher rates, I think Vietnam is 20%, he would need to begin this Section 301 process of going country by country with some sort of investigation into wrongdoing. And he can easily do that for China to get back up to 30% or whatever rate he wants. It'll be harder to substantiate for some countries like South Korea, for example. We have a free trade agreement with them. Why would it be the case that they are somehow unfair trade between those countries? So I think in some cases it'll be harder to substantiate. So there will be winners and losers from that some countries will see their tariffs restored. Others will see them end up lower in the end. But I think we're still going to have pretty high tariffs, even if he loses IEEPA authority.
All right, Don, let's pivot. You've written recently on some implications coming into tax refund season next year and for the consumer, and it sounds to be some upside there. So can you touch on the highlights there?
Yeah. So the Big Beautiful Bill, known as OBBB, or OBA for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I think that's the easiest thing to say. In that bill, there's, a combination of policies. You have new tax cuts for individuals, which are on top of the extensions of the 2017 reforms. So all the figures I'm citing here, I don't talk about the cost of extending existing policy. It's not net new stimulus to anyone. So you have a bunch of new individual tax cuts. You have corporate tax cuts concentrated on CapEx, And then you have spending cuts that are really going to be borne by the mid and low end consumer. So that's Medicaid, student loans, food stamps, or what's known as SNAP, and then healthcare as well. The ACA credits have been cut pretty meaningfully in the bill. So, and of course, boosting defense spending and immigration spending. But we're just talking about the consumer piece and in particular, the tax bill. What's unique about what's happening is, back in 2017, when I was a part of the effort to write the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we didn't do retroactive policy. So we passed a bill on December 20th, it's 2017. And so we were basically changing withholding right away for, say, January 2018. And people didn't really realize that they were getting the benefit of the law. And in fact, when their withholding went down and they potentially owed more money at tax time, they were frustrated. So people didn't realize they got these tax cuts when in fact they got very large tax cuts. So what Republicans did this time around, now that the bill passed in July, they retroactively cut taxes for 2025. Not a lot of people are, going to their employer and saying, I'd like to adjust my withholding, or how would you even do so for a tips or overtime when the rules aren't completely written or clear yet? So a lot of people are just going to be surprised by very large refunds when they file their taxes. And so there are a number of provisions that are cutting taxes. For example, the SALT cap was raised from $10,000 to $40,000 for people earning under $500,000. So that's really going to be in kind of upper middle income. Say people earning, say, $200,000 to $500,000 are going to see the bulk of that benefit. You have an overtime deduction. That's, I think, $12,500 per person, up to people earning $300,000, I believe, is the limit. A $25,000 deduction for tips, interest deductibility on auto loans. There's only certain auto loans like Made in America cars. A senior citizens deduction that's worth $6,000, an enhanced child tax credit, and an enhanced standard deduction. So when you add all those things up, there should be about $187 billion in tax cuts, net new tax cuts for individuals in calendar 26. So that's GDP, about 30 trillion. So we're talking 0.6% of GDP. That's meaningful. But these are going to be really concentrated in the front half of the year. So the way I think about it, of those, I said 187, it's 191 billion. So 91 billion, I think, will come in the form of refunds. That will be, traditionally, people get them in, say, February, end of February to end of April. And so there's 90 billion that's going to go out then. Most of it, I think, will be in refunds, but of course, someone might be under withheld. So when they file their taxes, they're getting a big tax cut they weren't expecting, but it just means they owe less than they otherwise would. So that's 90 billion there, plus another 25 billion per quarter in withholding. It's about 120, 130 billion, within the first 4 months of the year that consumers are going to get. So that's meaningful support for the consumer. And I think it's larger than some people had expected, just because, the official cost estimates for the legislation say some of this money was going to go out in 2025, and it just doesn't look like that's going to be the case.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I'm sure you're going to be talking about it as we get closer to it. But, in the context for financial markets, and one of the concerns being about a soft labor market and the consumer and how strong or weak they are, that certainly sets up for some potential upside surprise to both consumer data, consumer earnings and related, and possibly interest rates next year. So we'll make sure we keep that in mind as we think about market risks, both to the upside and perhaps downside in the first quarter.
Yeah, I could add just a little follow-on to that, which is, individual tax cuts tend to be very well estimated. It's just a matter of timing. And I think some tax season will be a little messy because, for example, the way they define overtime income is, FSLA driven. So it's not like you don't know what your eligible overtime income is. Normally you would get a W-2 that tells you what that is. Now you won't. So tax season could be a mess for tips and overtime. I think the IRS will lean on being taxpayer friendly, but so best we can do is say, what did the government estimate? It's probably close to right. There was more of a dispute corporate side. We've done some work on this and it looks like the government estimates are going to be right. If you look at what just happened in September, those are first quarterly estimated payments. We got about 65 billion in corporate tax cuts, we think, which is kind of consistent with what the government was saying. So, in the context of you're saying how, the consumer might behave, how the economy might respond, rates, et cetera. When we net all of these things together, the tariffs, the tax cuts for individuals and businesses, the spending cuts, we will probably be roughly fiscally neutral, meaning like we run a 6.5% of GDP deficit now. That will also probably be the case next year. So a lot of these things are kind of netting out, but who is a net winner and loser varies pretty significantly.
Is there any uncertainty around how big of that tips income component is? I'm thinking just in the context of the last several years, how, 15, 20 years ago, I would say nearly 100% of any tip I would leave would be cash. And nowadays it's probably 80% or so. It's part of, a credit card transaction, thus more likely to be recognized, where I would imagine some of those cash tips were not recognized. Is that kind of showing up in any of the data or making perhaps some of these numbers bigger than expected, or is that not big enough to show up?
I think there will be a lot of effort to recategorize income that was just ordinary income, not tipped income.
Sure.
There will be guardrails around that. Ultimately, the most important guardrail that's set up here is a $25,000 limit. So you can reclassify all you want and get an audit, but ultimately you're capped out at that 25,000. So I think that will prove to be the most important limit they have on gaming the system.
All right, Don. Well, that was a masterclass. So I certainly can not have to read any of the news or watch the news this weekend, because I think you've given me all the important points that we and our listeners need to know. So we thank you, as always, for joining us. And of course, we'll have you back as the story plays out. For any of those interested in policy, it's been a roller coaster and likely to continue to be one. So thanks again for joining us, Don.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of What's Next for Markets. You can subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow Michael on X at Michael Cantro. If you like the show, please let us know by leaving a positive review. The preceding commentary is not financial advice. You should always seek appropriate financial advice from a professional financial advisor in your state. You should not consider this as a substitute for these services. Piper Sandler does and seeks to do business with companies covered in its research commentary or coverage. As a result, investors should be aware that the firm may have a conflict of interest that could affect the objectivity of this commentary. Investors should consider this commentary as only a single factor in making their investment decisions. For full disclosure information, visit www.pipersandler.com/researchdisclosures.